So I'm sure all of you are aware by now that there are these websites on the internet where you can go and you can pay for a star that you can name and you can gift it to someone, and that all of those websites are totally fake. Well, there is a not well known way to do this not fakely. You can actually find something in space that's real and give it a name. However, it's going to cost many thousands of dollars in telescope gear and probably take several years learning how to capture deep sky images, but it can be done. And I actually finally managed to accomplish this myself. I made my own very first discovery called Fa1, Fa1, taking my last name Falls, and it is called the Kyber crystal nebula in Monoceros. And here it is. So the Kyber crystal nebula in Monoceros, or Fa1, is a pretty mysterious object. We don't really know exactly what it is yet, but what I can tell you about it is that it is a very faint, low surface brightness, primarily Oiii nebula in the constellation Monoceros, between the Seagull and the Rosette, closer to the Seagull Nebula. Now, we think this object is having a similar nature to one you may already be familiar with, which is the Squid Nebula. Now, the Squid Nebula is also an object of mysterious nature, but they're both similar in that they are likely some type of ionized interstellar medium, which is just kind of the floating gas that's out there between stars, and if you heat it up enough or pressurize it, it starts to ionize and glow O3. So there is a star in the middle of this nebula I discovered that is a very hot subdwarf type star that we think is the actual source of the nebula, and just by the heat and pressure coming from the star, it's ionized the surrounding material to create this really interesting structure. The people I've been working with, Marcel, Xavier, and Pascal, they seem to kind of trend towards the idea that this is likely an ionized interstellar material nebula and not a planetary nebula, solely because we couldn't find a star in the middle that quite suited the narrative of a planetary nebula. A planetary nebula tends to form when a star sheds its outer layers close to its death, leaving behind a white dwarf and a circular cloud of ionized gas that came from the layers of the host star. Now, the problem with this nebula I discovered is there is no white dwarf in the middle, so it's something more mysterious in nature. A lot of the discoveries that amateurs make are typically planetary nebula, but this one has been a bit difficult to get confirmed and everything because of its odd nature. Anyways, let me tell you a little bit about the whole process of discovering this object. So amateurs doing astrophotography can make discoveries in, broadly speaking, two ways. There's the serendipitous discovery where you're imaging something else that's well known and you just say, oh, we're going to try a new filter, or we're going to look at it in a bit more depth than it has been before, like in the case of the Andromeda oxygen arc with the ANS discovery. This is something that's a bit serendipitous. There are other ways that I would say are more brute force, and these involve either the first option, which is searching through professional images, like professional sky surveys, like the IFAS or the SHS sky surveys in H-alpha. You can scan these, zoom way in, and just scroll through, and eventually discover something on your own if you're just scrolling through and looking through it. However, that's not a whole lot of fun. It requires a lot of work. Serendipitous discoveries are rare, so I've kind of been opting to go a different route with attempting to discover a nebula, which is just pointing my telescope in random spots of the sky. And this is kind of a brute force method, but I kind of like it in that it's a bit pure. We're looking for things that literally haven't been photographed ever before, and it's just cool to go out with the sense of exploration. So this is how I've been doing it, and it hasn't panned out until pretty recently with, of course, this object. So since I've been sort of imaging all over the night sky, the reason I've been doing this, like this style of looking for discoveries, is because it allows me to search regions that haven't been covered by professional observatories, and it allows me to look at wavelengths that haven't been covered by professional observatories. So knowing this, I've largely been focusing on the oxygen 3 emission line because there is no resource that really covers this in any amount of depth to find big low surface brightness objects. So I've mostly just been searching in O3 pretty much everywhere, because everywhere is fair game for O3 at the moment. So the actual way I picked this spot is I was imaging something else earlier in the evening, and this was back in December when I discovered it. So earlier in the evening I was looking at, something else, probably around Orion or Andromeda. And then later in the evening I was like, I have 3 hours of exposure time to spare for the night. I'm just gonna put my telescope somewhere random. And I picked like a random spot between the rosette and the Seagull, and I just started firing away. Now, after 1 or 2 nights of imaging, I had enough data to actually analyze my source images. And I used the process of continuum subtraction, where I took a green and a blue image, and I used the median of those to subtract the continuum spectrum from my oxygen 3 data, allowing me to kind of pick out structures a bit more easily. And there are 2 main things I noticed in my first discovery images. First off, there was the big wave that was at Fa1, the object I discovered, and there was also Stratner-Drechsler 44. If you end up doing this yourself and you search the night sky for objects, you'll find that a lot of the obvious ones have already been discovered by Marcel and Xavier. They have discoveries pretty much spanning the whole night sky. So they've already covered many of the things out there that at least can be covered by professional surveys. They've already got them. So if you go exploring, then you're more likely than not to run into a Stratner-Drechsler object at some point, which is pretty fun. So I got my continuum image, I picked out a unique structure. The next thing I had to do was actually had to go through and verify with the databases about whether or not this object could be registered already. So I end up checking the HASH Planetary Nebula database. I check Pascal Ledoux' Planetary Nebula website to see if anyone else has discovered it. Then I check the Vizier catalog and then the CDS Strasbourg database. I check everything and nothing showed up. So this is kind of like a bingo sign that, something is there. You have a faint object, you've identified no one else has ever seen it before, and now you have to move on to the next steps to actually verifying this thing. So first off, for planetary nebula, you have to kind of rule out some possibilities, and you have to find some kind of reasoning for your object. So you have to make sure first that it's not a H beta region or H2 region, which could be a planetary nebula mimic. You can still make discoveries in H beta regions. I think it's a bit less common to actually get it cataloged though. So you have to check in the infrared wavelengths, make sure there's no structure in infrared so you can rule out the H beta, and then you have to also go through and look for a host star to your nebula. Like I was explaining earlier, a planetary nebula will have a white dwarf at its core and then the outer layers. So if you find something and you can identify a white dwarf centrally located to your nebula, then it's kind of a dead giveaway. You have a planetary nebula, and it's super easy to get it confirmed because obviously a white dwarf leads to a planetary nebula. I didn't get lucky. Well, I did get lucky, but I didn't have a white dwarf in the middle of my nebula. There were a couple located around the vicinity inside, but none of them were centrally located. And this was my big struggle with getting this thing confirmed, is the fact that there's no reasonable host star. So Marcel Drechsler and Xavier Stratner, since they know way more about discoveries in astrophysics and nebula formation than I do, they went through and they helped me identify some potential stars. And it wasn't until I had my finished image with the interior structure that Xavier was able to identify a specific Gaia star, which was a hot subdwarf type star, which could be ionizing the surrounding interstellar material to create this new object. So without their help, I pretty much would be completely lost as to what stars are valid towards the discovery. You know what I mean? We're diving into the unknown, so having their help was certainly critical to actually getting something like this confirmed. So after I made my discovery in, I think, late December, the bomb cyclone hit California. Super bummer. So I had to wait like a whole month and a half before I could start imaging. But after the clouds passed, I started getting to work on capturing my finished image, which you're seeing here now took about 80 hours of exposure time. And I used my main bread and butter setup at Sierra Remote Observatory, which is my reduced Takahashi FSQ 106 and QHY 600 system on a Paramount Mighty, and I have the full details for the system on my website. But I basically just started imaging it every single night. This object is incredibly faint in hydrogen and sulfur. But the nice thing is the general region of the nebula, there is a lot of hydrogen and sulfur just randomly scattered around the nebula. So if you're looking to photograph this yourself, there is some intrigue to be had in all wavelengths, but the object itself is really just oxygen. It's very, very oxygen dominant, just like the Squid Nebula is, which also, kind of gives some hints to that it is probably an interstellar, an ISM material type nebula. So going forward with this object, it's probably going to get some kind of spectroscopic observation follow-up at some point by Pascal and his team that he works with. They independently verify a lot of amateur discoveries using spectroscopy, so they'll likely do that to try and find some more information about the object, which is super, super cool because it would be great to learn more. So just as a final thought, this image kind of represents for me like a big shift in the way I'm doing astrophotography. Not just this image, but also the Andromeda Arc discovery. Going forward, I'm pretty much just dedicating my time to looking for new things in the night sky instead of known things. And I'm sure in the future, I'll continue to image, these more well-known objects because I have to sell prints, at some point. But I'm just a lot more inspired to go searching through the unknown for new objects these days. My friend Derek, who I have a couple workshops upcoming with my friend Derek, so I'll have a link in the description if you want to come learn astro in some national parks. Definitely check that out. But Derek has been, you could call it bullying or bantering, but making fun of me for imaging the same things year over year. Like, this is the classical critique of astrophotography, is that we're all taking photos of the same thing and we're taking the same photos over and over and over again. And it's not really creative. And there is some truth to that, in that it wouldn't be creative for me to go and take an image of M42 because I've done it before 100 times and it's not really creatively challenging. So Derek has always made fun of me for not creatively challenging myself, and that thought has been sticking more and more with me lately, especially, after getting to know Marcel and Xavier a bit more. I've just been inspired by all of these people to try and go out and do something like this on my own and try and do something a bit more creative. That's pretty much everything about the discovery. Big thanks, of course, to Marcel, Xavier, and Pascal for helping for some of the research of this object. Without being inspired by these people and having their help for doing some of the scientific research, none of this would be possible or would have happened for me in the first place. Yeah, I'm going to leave you with the final image now. And if any of you out there are astrophotographers and you're looking to shoot this yourself, maybe you're also bored of shooting Rosette every year or Orion, this object is out right now. It's pretty well positioned. I'll give you its coordinates in the description so you can, center on it or slew your telescope accurately, because you're not going to find the coordinates for it anywhere else but here. So I'll give you those. But if you're looking to shoot it yourself, shoot a lot of oxygen. There's nothing really happening in RGB, so just get a lot of oxygen, a little bit of hydrogen and sulfur to get the background areas, but this nebula is all oxygen. So if you want to try shooting it yourself, I'd recommend dedicate a couple moonless nights, just the oxygen, and you should get a great image. Especially those of you with RASAs, a RASA 8 or a RASA 11, you should be able to do very well on this object. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know this one is going to be a bit brief. I'm in the process of moving and the telescope is remote, so having a lot of story about the telescope is quite difficult to get. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to help support the channel, I have fine art prints of this image available on my website. The link is in the description. I'll catch you all in the next video.